Hello, this is reporter Julie Spencer, and I'd like to welcome you to Newsline Iowa City. Please join me today as we talk about recent political trends with Nicholas Johnson, University of Iowa law professor. He is perhaps best known for his term as commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, during which he was featured on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine and published How to Talk Back to Your Television Set. He also served as a presidential advisor for Jimmy Carter for the White House Conference on Library and Information Services. With the ushering in of the new Trump administration, we have seen many changes in the White House. Can you comment on his attacks on the media, and do you foresee any erosion of our First Amendment rights?
Well, with regard to the First Amendment, it's important to make some distinctions at the beginning that a journalist does not have a First Amendment right. The person who has a First Amendment right is the owner of the media. The First Amendment is only a restriction on what the government can do in restraining speech of citizens or of organized media or whatever. The other thing that's a necessary preliminary to answer your question is to explore what do we mean by democracy? What are the major elements of a democracy? And one of those, of course, is the right to vote. And we've gradually expanded that over the years. Another is certainly the First Amendment, that people not be restrained in what they have to say as a result of government action. But there are many other components. And it's interesting to note that when Thomas Jefferson wrote his own epitaph, that what he most wanted to be remembered for was that he was the father of the University of Virginia. He did not even mention the fact that he'd been president. Education was so important to him. Now, in addition to that, we need not only the access to knowledge that we get through public libraries and so forth, but he famously said, if I were asked to choose between a government with no newspapers and newspapers with no government, I would not hesitate to choose the latter. And then he went on to say, but I would also want the people to be able to get access to those newspapers and to have the education that would enable them to read them and make sense out of them. So now we have not only the right to vote, which we've expanded from white males over 21 who own land to now minorities, women, everybody over 18, and so forth. So when anybody attacks the integrity of our judges or the integrity of our media or fails to give public libraries the resources they need or stands in the way of people voting or stands in the way of the lower middle class and the poor being able to afford a college education. Those are anti-American acts, if I may borrow from Senator Joe McCarthy, but I mean, here's a context where you can talk about anti-American. When a legislature gerrymanders districts, when they require a photo ID for somebody to vote, when they have the day for voting on a work day and many people can't get away from work to vote, those are anti-American acts. When the Iowa legislature fails to properly fund institutions of higher education in Iowa, that is an anti-American act. And when Trump attacks the media, that is an anti-American act. When you have an affirmative desire and effort to reduce the confidence of the American people in the mass media upon which a democracy is so dependent, that it be an independent media, that it be tied to factual reporting to the American people, then you are really attacking democracy. And I think it needs to be seen in those terms. This is not just a Twitter war where he wakes up in the morning and starts sending out hateful tweets at 5 a.m. We're talking about the fundamental pillars of a democracy. And you'll notice that oftentimes, most recently in Kabul, Afghanistan, what do people who are fighting a nation go after first? They went after the television station in Afghanistan. What did Putin do in Russia first? He took over the mass media. So this is central to what an authoritarian dictator knows that they need to do. Because whoever controls the media will control that nation. And democracy requires independent media with diversification of ownership, diversification of participants. And right now we might as well take a bit of a break for my colleague Shelley Kurtz and his wonderful whistling abilities. I think I was to the end of the answer to that.
Do you see the need for more gun control and debate over and the possibility of repealing the Second Amendment?
Well, I don't think there's much likelihood of a repeal of the Second Amendment. My own interpretation of it has been contrary to that of the courts. And obviously, as a former Supreme Court law clerk, I think we should follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. So I'm not suggesting anything contrary to that. But I think it really was as they say, a well-regulated militia that they were talking about. And indeed, back in the 1930s, I think it was the president of the National Rifle Association said that he thought it was totally inappropriate for people to just willy-nilly have guns and walk around with them. Every time we have another mass shooting, the response from the gun lobby, the manufacturers of guns, and the activist members of the NRA, who I must say are a well-organized political force, and as Cokie Roberts, who I was with at that Library of Congress event. But as she said this morning on NPR, the people who don't agree with them ought to get as well organized as the NRA supporters are and contribute money and participate in campaigns and go about the way we do it in a democratic society and get organized. But a couple things are said usually after one of these. One is, well, it's too early to talk about gun control now. We need to wait until we go through the grieving process and so forth. But then somehow we never get back to it. And the other is, of course, that they say, well, the problem is not guns. The problem is mental illness. And we need to do more about mental illness. So what did Trump and the Republicans do about mental illness? One of the only things that they got passed was a law that we could no longer keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. So if they really think it's about mental illness, why are they doing that? The other point to make is that other countries with higher rates of mental illness than we have in this country, higher rates of suicide, have a small, tiny fraction of the number of gun killings that we have. So if this really is tied to mental illness, how come it is that they don't have more shootings? Doesn't that perhaps have something to do with the fact that they don't have access to guns? Is it really all about mental illness, or does the gun play some role in a shooting? I sympathized with Bernie Sanders' approach on this in Vermont, and he made the point that there are people who have rifles for hunting or for self-protection out in very low population areas or whatever. But those are rifles and shotguns. They are not automatic rifles that have been boosted so they can fire multiple bullets a second. They're not weapons of war and so forth. And that I think people really do think about this differently in different parts of the country. That in rural areas they have had a tradition of hunting, and rifles, single shot rifles or shotguns are not going to mow down 30 or 50 or more people at a time. And they have a tradition of it. They probably went hunting when they were 10 years old and taught how to handle a rifle and so forth. On the other hand, people in the urban areas are more concerned about the handguns and the carnage on their streets in a city like Chicago. I mean, it's just so one can understand the position of both groups. I think I don't know that hunters would put the greatest emphasis on having handguns. And I don't think the gangs that are shooting each other in Chicago really care that much about rifles. But I think there are an enormous number of things we could do that would reduce this. And one would be to permit the Centers for Disease Control to treat this as a matter of public health. When I was involved with the Iowa Institute for Health, Behavior, and Environmental Policy as one of the co-directors, I wrote a paper about gun injuries as a public health issue. And Congress forbids them to even gather data on it. I mean, it's just totally nuts. And some of the safety features that could be built into handguns would be helpful, and prohibiting the sale of military machine guns would be helpful, and would not impede on the what the gun owners perceive as their constitutional right to have the guns that they actually use for sport or target shooting or hunting or whatever they do.
Okay. Could you touch a bit on Trump's foreign policy stance, especially with reference to North Korea?
I share the view of many foreign policy experts, of which I am not one, but I share their view that Trump's approach to North Korea is really very dangerous. The idea of threatening to wipe out an entire country, presumably with nuclear weapons, without a minimum a substantial spillover into China and South Korea. I mean, it's just, I don't want to use any expletives, but is a very dangerous and thoughtless thing to do. I think a lot of Trump's problem, he obviously had an appeal on the kind of compared to what scale for many of his supporters, who some of whom even said, well, I don't know whether he's going to be able to do anything about my problem, but at least he came out here and talked to me about it. Something one would have hoped the Democrats would have seen the wisdom of doing, and are still struggling with their loyalty to both Wall Street and people who need their help, and that remains to be seen what they will do. But I think he came into government with no experience and very little knowledge. Now, when Lyndon Johnson appointed me U.S. Maritime Administrator, I had very little knowledge about government, how to manage a government agency, or about shipping, shipbuilding, and ports, and so forth. But I took a solid 3 weeks and read like crazy and got to the point where I didn't have all the answers, but at least I knew what the questions were and I knew how to understand the answers that I got to my questions. I think Trump has demonstrated a lack of curiosity, a lack of an interest in learning about the presidency, because so much of it, like the British government, is a matter of norms and mores and the way we do it, and the fact that you don't send out tweets or their equivalent off the top of your head, but you staff stuff out. You've got a lot of really expert people there who want to help. And to say, for example, he doesn't want to see the CIA briefing every morning. Well, I wanted to see the briefings. I wanted to know what was going on when I was responsible for shipping sea lift to Vietnam. And I just think he doesn't have that kind of curiosity. And plus, I think he's got a lot of personal problems. His attitude toward women, and his willingness to just lash out at people, his need that's been described as narcissistic by a great many people, in addition to the psychiatrists who've said that, that are unfortunately psychological qualities that make him not very well suited, basically for, to be on the Iowa City Council, let alone President of the United States.
And my last question, what trends do you see going into the future?
Well, there are trends with regard to all kinds of things.
Political trends.
Oh, political trends,
Yeah.
okay. I think we're on the cusp of going either direction. We just had a city council election, 15% of the people in Iowa City turned out to vote. I think that unless more people take an interest in government, more people, I think we have an issue with media that is related to this in terms of one of our local papers that has now been so decimated by its owner that it's not really in a position to give us the information we need about what's going on in our community. I don't blame the local people who are with that paper. It's not their fault. It's their conglomerate owner that's squeezing them. But we must have abundant and quality factual reporting on the challenges that we confront in our local communities. You've asked me about racism, the disparity in income, challenges of education, of transportation, of housing, and so forth. Those stories need to be in the papers. And there's another local paper that does a relatively good job of that, given the resources that they have available to them. But that's absolutely essential. And what we're teaching our kids in the schools about political participation. We want to judge our kids based on their test scores and so forth. How about taking a list of the graduates from City High and West High, and 5 years after they've graduated, look and see how many of them are registered to vote. How many of them do vote in city council elections and school board elections. All right? That's a measure of how well you're teaching government, civics, whatever you call it, if you are still teaching what we used to call civics, which was one of the original 19th century purposes for having K-12 education. So if we don't do what we need to do with regard to education and making it easier for people to vote and educating them properly and providing them the information they need about their local community, not to mention the state and the nation and the world, from their local media, and that they have an interest in curiosity and learning that and then acting on it. If we do that, I think we have a prayer of maybe within a generation overcoming what Trump has done to us and what 40% of the American people have essentially asked him to do, and turning that around and bringing us back to the kind of patriotism and participation we had during the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s and early 70s. I think we can make America that kind of great again. But it is going to be one terrible struggle. It was struggle enough before Trump ever appeared on the scene. And he's done nothing but make it worse and worse and worse and worse with regard to all of these pillars of a democracy. So the other path we might follow is the path we're now on, leading to more authoritarian oligarchs, dictators, surveillance of the American people, a dumbing down of the media and the schools, creating more and more lack of respect for, even anger at the mass media that are left and are trying to do a job, more and more support for the great leader. That we have plenty of history on how that process works, and we're going right down that path. There's no question about that. We are in the beginning stages of what other historic dictators have done. And I won't name them because I don't want to characterize Trump in that way. But we're certainly at the early stages of that. So if we do nothing, that's the path we will continue to follow. And if Trump does not serve a second term and then get the law changed so that he can serve beyond 2 terms, get the Constitution changed, which he would probably be able to do if we continue on this path, and then we have him forever. But if we don't have him forever and he only serves 2 terms, then we're going to have another one just like him, because that's how you win elections in America at that point. I just think that is such a terrible and dangerous, and I fear for my kids and my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren now, I'm of that age, and I don't really see right now the strength in the Democratic Party to turn that around. I see apprehension in the Republican Party about not appearing to be supportive of Trump. So I don't quite see where, and the media is decimated and is now thought by the Trump 40% as being all fake news and people who hate America and so forth. So I don't hold out a lot of hope, I'm sorry to say. I wish I could. The potential is there, as I described, what we have to do to go the other path. And the question is, how many of us are willing to do that?
Do you see the American people rising up, or just
well, that is the question. Will we? I don't now see that. No, I do not. And I do not see a path to that being created.
Why is that?
Well, I think you need an organized mass of people to do it. And the Democratic Party would be in a position to do it, but it's been so wedded to Wall Street and the major donors, and it's really turned its back on people in abject poverty, people who are poor, the working class, the trade unions, essentially the bottom 80% economically of this country. If the Democratic Party had continued with the base that it had during the 30s and 40s and actually talked to those people, went to visit them, continued knocking on doors and getting to know their neighbors, advocating on their behalf, producing results on their behalf, they would today, I mean, it's 80% of the American people, they would today win every election from school board and the courthouse to the White House. Hands down, they'd win everything. But they've taken the path of saying what's most important is to raise $100 million, $1 billion, whatever it takes, to buy the television time to reach people indirectly through television and social media. And we're not going to have this personal contact anymore. That's the problem. Democrats could do it, but they weren't willing to do it with Bernie Sanders. I mean, consider this. Here's a guy from Brooklyn who's moved to Vermont. He has no national following. He has no collection of major donors. He's an avowed socialist. And he goes out there and raises the money, $27 a contribution, enough to match Hillary Clinton and do a very substantial job of running against her, coming from nothing. And she has the full backing of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic leadership is overtly opposed to Bernie Sanders. The media wouldn't put him on the air, and he had that support. They turn their back on that. They turn their back on that, and they lose. Of course they lose. Because if somebody wants to go with what the Republicans are advocating, why go for Republican light? Why not vote for the Republican? And if those are the people you're appealing to, you ain't going to win, because more of them are going to look at you and your ties to big business and big donors and billionaires and Wall Street, and they're going to say, well, shoot, if that's what I want, I think I'm going to have a better shot at getting that from a Republican than I will from a Democrat. And so they turn their back on their natural constituency, and they can't appeal to the other constituency, and so they lose elections. It seems to me pretty simple, but apparently it's much more complex than I understand.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking with me. It's very informative. I've enjoyed it greatly.
Well, I've enjoyed it too, and I thank you for the invitation.
Okay, thanks.